The glass shattered first. Then came the scream. Victoria Reynolds, one of the wealthiest CEOs in America, was 3 seconds from drowning in the freezing harbor water when a stranger's hand closed around her wrist like a vice and yanked her back from the edge of death. Cameras were rolling. The whole city was watching. And when a reporter shoved a microphone in her face and asked, "Is this man your husband?" Victoria Reynolds, a woman who had never once in her life failed to correct a lie in a boardroom, looked into the eyes of a Navy SEAL she had known for exactly 6 weeks, and said nothing at all. That silence would cost her everything. Stick around, because by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why a woman who built an empire on the truth chose in front of the entire world to let a lie stand. If you're watching this from Texas, Ohio, or anywhere else in this great country, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled tonight. And if stories like this move you, hit subscribe, because we've got 2 hours of this ahead of us, and it only gets heavier from here. The wind off the harbor that night was the kind that cut through wool coats like they were paper. Victoria Reynolds stood near the edge of the private dock in her charcoal gray blazer, a glass of champagne she hadn't touched, sitting untouched on the railing beside her, watching the lights of the naval research vessel bob against the black water. She was 51 years old, though the tabloids liked to shave 5 years off that number, and she had not cried in front of another human being since her father's funeral 11 years earlier. She was not planning on crying tonight either. Tonight was business. Tonight was optics. Tonight was the quarterly gala for Reynolds Defense Systems, the company her grandfather had built from a single machine shop in Ohio into a global contractor with its name stitched into half the Navy's surveillance technology. She had 200 guests behind her in the ballroom, a board of directors who watched her like hawks circling a wounded rabbit, and a business partner named Damian Cross, who smiled at her from across every room like he was already measuring the walls for his own portrait. She did not notice the storm rolling in until the first gust nearly took her champagne glass off the railing. "Ma'am, you should step back from the edge." The voice came from behind her, low, even the kind of voice that didn't ask twice. She turned, expecting a security guard, and instead found herself looking at a man in a plain black jacket. No name tag, no company badge, just a face carved out of quiet discipline and eyes that missed nothing. "Excuse me," Victoria said, the CEO voice sliding into place automatically, the one that made junior executives stammer. "The dock's wet. The railing's rated for decoration, not weight. You lean on it in this wind, you're going in the water." He said it the way a man reads a weather report, no drama, just fact. Victoria almost laughed. Almost. Nobody spoke to her like that, not anymore. Not since the company had crossed the billion-dollar mark, and every conversation she had became a performance for someone. "And who exactly are you?" "Lieutenant Commander Ryan Mitchell, Navy. I'm running dock security for the research vessel tonight." He nodded toward the ship, anchored 50 yards out its hull, dark against the churning water. "Not your party. I don't care about your party." That last part landed strangely on her. Not rude, just honest. She realized, standing there in her $4,000 dress, that this was the first sentence spoken to her all evening that wasn't angling for something. "Well, Lieutenant Commander," she said, "I appreciate the safety briefing." She turned back toward the water, and that was the moment the wave hit. It came without warning, a rogue swell that slammed against the dock pilings and sent a sheet of spray straight up over the railing. The wood beneath her heels, slick with sea mist, betrayed her in an instant. Her ankle rolled, her balance broke. And for one full second, a second that would replay in her mind for the rest of her life, Victoria Reynolds felt her body pitching backward toward black water and jagged rock with absolutely nothing between her and the harbor floor. She didn't even have time to scream. What she felt instead was an arm solid as a steel beam wrapping around her waist and hauling her forward with a force that knocked the air out of her lungs. She collided hard into a chest that didn't move an inch on impact, like she'd fallen into a wall instead of a man. Her champagne glass shattered on the dock. Somewhere behind them, a woman screamed. And Victoria Reynolds, CEO billionaire, a woman who had negotiated with senators without blinking, stood frozen in the arms of a Navy officer she had met 90 seconds earlier, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. "I've got you," Ryan said quiet, right against her ear, so only she could hear it over the wind. "I've got you. You're not going anywhere." For a moment, neither of them moved. The gala guests had turned phones, already lifting the flash of a dozen cameras catching the CEO of Reynolds Defense, wrapped in the arms of a stranger in a black jacket, her hair wild from the wind, her mascara starting to run. Victoria pulled back first, smoothing her dress with hands that would not stop trembling, trying to reassemble the armor she'd worn for 20 years in under 5 seconds. "Thank you," she managed. "That was thank you." Ryan studied her for a long moment, the way a man checks a wound before deciding how serious it is. "You're in shock. Sit down before you fall down for real this time." "I don't sit down in front of 200 donors, Lieutenant Commander." "Then sit down somewhere they can't see you." There was no argument in his voice, no negotiation, just the calm certainty of a man who had made split-second decisions his entire career and had learned a long time ago that hesitation gets people killed. Victoria found herself following him, actually following, letting someone else lead for the first time in longer than she could remember, around the side of the ballroom to a service stairwell where the noise of the party faded into a dull murmur behind heavy doors. She sat on the second step. He crouched in front of her, checking her ankle without asking permission, his hands quick and clinical. "It's not broken," he said. "You'll bruise. You a medic too. SEAL training covers a lot of ground." He said it flatly, no pride in it, like he was reciting a fact about the weather. He stood put, a respectful distance between them, and looked away toward the stairwell door, instead of at her, giving her privacy to collect herself. "You're a SEAL," Victoria repeated. "Not just Navy security." "I didn't say that." "You just did." A small, almost invisible flicker crossed his face, something between irritation and reluctant respect. "I don't talk about that. It's not who I am anymore. Not the part that matters anyway." "And what part matters?" He was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice had changed, dropped into something rougher, something real. "I've got a 6-year-old at home who thinks I sell furniture for a living because it's easier to explain than the truth. That's the part that matters." Victoria blinked. Of all the answers she'd expected from a man who had just hauled her back from the edge of a dock, like she weighed nothing, that wasn't one of them. "A daughter, Lily." He said the name like it cost him something, and gave him everything at once. "Her mother passed 3 years ago. Car accident. I was on deployment when it happened. Got the call on a satellite phone in the middle of a mission I still can't talk about, and by the time I got home, she'd already been buried 2 weeks. The words came out plainly. No self-pity in them, the way a man speaks when he has told himself this story so many times in his own head that the pain has been sanded down into fact. But Victoria heard what was underneath it anyway. She had built a career reading people who didn't want to be read, and what she read in Ryan Mitchell's face was a grief that had never actually finished happening. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it more than she'd meant anything she'd said all night. "Don't be. It's old news." He finally looked at her again, and something in his expression shifted, like he'd surprised himself by saying that much to a stranger. "You should get back to your party, Ms. Reynolds." "You know my name." "Everyone in this harbor knows your name. Big banner with your face on it at the entrance in case you forgot." She almost smiled. Almost. "Fair point." He extended a hand to help her up. She took it, and for half a second before either of them let go, something passed between them that neither one acknowledged out loud, a kind of recognition. Two exhausted people who had spent years being strong for everyone except themselves, standing in a stairwell that smelled like salt water and cheap champagne. "Thank you," she said again. "Really, just doing my job." He turned to walk back toward the dock, back toward his post, back toward the version of himself that didn't get involved with billionaire CEOs at black tie galas. "Lieutenant Commander." He stopped. "The vessel you're guarding," Victoria said. "It's under Reynolds' defense contract, which means technically, I'm your employer for the next 6 weeks. Something in his jaw tightened, like he already didn't like where this was going. "Ma'am, I don't need special treatment because I fished you out of the water." "That's not what I'm offering." She straightened her dress, found her CEO voice again, but there was something warmer underneath it now, something that hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier. "I'm offering to buy you a cup of coffee tomorrow morning to thank the man who saved my life. That's all. No press, no cameras, just coffee." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she almost regretted asking. Then he nodded once, the smallest concession a disciplined man could make. 6 a.m. I've got to get Lily to school by 7:30. 6 a.m. She agreed. He walked away without another word back into the storm, back to his post, on a dock. She now understood he would have thrown himself into the harbor to protect if the situation had demanded it. Victoria stood alone in the stairwell for a full minute before she went back to face her guests. Her ankle throbbing, her dress damp at the hem, and something unfamiliar sitting in her chest that she couldn't name yet. She would spend the next 6 weeks trying to name it, and by the time she succeeded, it would already be too late to keep it simple. The coffee shop Ryan picked was nothing like the places Victoria usually met people. No marble counters, no baristas who recognized her face from the business pages. Just a cramped diner 3 blocks from the Naval Yard, with vinyl booths and a bell over the door that jingled when she walked in at 5:58 a.m., 2 minutes early, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap like she was trying to rob the place instead of thank someone. Ryan was already there, sitting in the back booth, in a gray t-shirt and jeans, looking like an entirely different person than the man in the black jacket from the night before. He looked younger out of uniform, tireder too. There were dark circles under his eyes that told her he hadn't slept much. "You're early," he said as she slid into the booth across from him. "I'm always early. It's a control thing. I noticed." He slid the coffee across the table toward her, already made, already the way she'd take it, though she hadn't told him. "Black, no sugar. You look like a black coffee person." "Lucky guess?" "I don't guess." A small, tired smile, first one she'd seen from him. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing important. The weather, the harbor, a story about a raccoon that had somehow gotten onto the research vessel and caused 40 minutes of chaos before anyone figured out what the alarm was actually about. Victoria laughed genuinely, laughed for what felt like the first time in months. And then, right at 6:20, Ryan checked his watch and started to slide out of the booth. "I've got to get Lily," he said. "She's not a morning person. If I'm late, she makes me pay for it in Cheerios thrown at my head." "Can I meet her sometime?" The question came out before Victoria had fully decided to ask it, and she watched Ryan's face close up like a door slamming fast and total. "No," he said, flat, immediate. "No offense, Ms. Reynolds, but Lily's already lost one parent. She doesn't need to get attached to people who disappear from her life the second things get complicated. And things are always complicated with people like you. People like me. CEOs, billionaires, people whose lives make headlines." He stood, pulled a few crumpled bills from his pocket to cover the coffee, even though she'd offered to pay. "I appreciate the thank you. I meant what I said last night, don't need special treatment. This was nice, but my daughter isn't part of whatever this is." He left before she could respond. The bell over the door jingling behind him, and Victoria sat alone in the booth for a long moment, staring at the black coffee he'd guessed correctly, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, the sting of being told no by someone who wanted nothing from her. She should have let it end there. Any reasonable person would have let it end there. She did not let it end there. Reynolds Defense Systems occupied 14 floors of glass and steel in the financial district, and Victoria's office on the top floor had a view of the harbor that had once felt like a trophy, and now, for reasons she refused to examine too closely, felt like a window into a life she'd started watching from the outside. "You've been distracted for a week," said Marcus Webb, her chief of staff, dropping a folder of quarterly projections on her desk Monday morning. "Distracted isn't a word anyone's used about you in the 15 years I've worked here." "I'm fine, Marcus. You canceled the Hendricks call twice." "The Hendricks call can wait." Marcus studied her the way a man studies a machine that's making a new noise. This wouldn't have anything to do with the incident at the gala, the one where half the internet is now speculating about the mystery man who caught you before you went into the harbor. Victoria's head snapped up. What are you talking about? He turned his laptop around. A grainy photo taken from someone's phone at the gala showed Ryan's arm wrapped around her waist, her hair wild. Both of their faces caught in profile in a moment that out of context looked far more intimate than it had actually been. The caption underneath from a gossip account with 400,000 followers read, "Is Reynolds' defense. CEO Victoria. Reynolds off the market. Mystery hero catches her fall and hearts." "It's nothing," Victoria said, closing the laptop a little too quickly. "He works dock security for the research vessel. He caught me before I fell in the water. That's the whole story." "Does the whole story include the fact that you've had coffee with him twice this week?" Victoria stared at him. "How do you know that?" "Because your driver logs your calendar. Victoria and I read everything that crosses my desk. It's my job." Marcus's voice softened, the 15 years of trust between them showing through the professional armor. "I'm not judging. God knows you deserve something outside of spreadsheets and board meetings. I'm just telling you that Damian Cross reads everything too, and he's not going to be as understanding as I am." The mention of Damian's name settled in Victoria's stomach like a stone. Damian Cross had joined the company 8 years earlier as a strategic investor, had slowly maneuvered his way onto the board, and had spent the last 2 years positioning himself as the obvious successor whenever Victoria's grip on the company loosened even slightly. He smiled in every meeting. He complimented her in every press release. And Victoria had never once trusted him, not for a single day. "Let Damian read whatever he wants," Victoria said. "I haven't done anything wrong." "You don't have to do anything wrong for it to become a problem. You just have to give people something to talk about." Marcus gathered his folder and headed for the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, you looked happier in that photo than I've seen you look in years. Just be careful, Victoria. People like Damian don't attack happiness. They attack whatever's attached to it." She didn't listen. She told herself she was too smart, too controlled, too experienced to let a warning like that actually change anything. And 3 days later, she found herself back at the Naval Yard, standing outside the security checkpoint at 4:45 p.m., waiting for Ryan's shift to end, holding a small stuffed rabbit she'd bought on impulse from a shop near her office without fully admitting to herself who it was for. Ryan came through the gate in his uniform, exhaustion written into every line of his posture, and stopped short when he saw her waiting. "Ms. Reynolds, this is a surprise." "I'm not here to see Lily," Victoria said quickly before he could tell her no again. "I know what you said. I'm not trying to push my way into your daughter's life. She held out the rabbit, feeling foolish the second it left her hand. "I saw this and thought she might like it. You don't have to give it to her. You can throw it away. I just wanted you to have it in case." Ryan looked at the rabbit for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. When he finally took it, his fingers brushed hers, and neither of them pulled away as fast as either of them probably should have. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. "I know. Most people who meet me for 5 minutes forget I exist by the next week. You've shown up twice." "Maybe I'm not most people." He studied her, and for the first time since the gala, she watched the wall around him crack just slightly, just enough to let something warmer through. "No," he said. "I don't think you are." They stood there in the parking lot as the sun started sinking behind the Naval Yard's cranes. Two people who had absolutely nothing in common on paper. A billionaire CEO and a widowed Navy SEAL raising a daughter alone. Finding against every rational instinct either of them had that the silence between them was the most comfortable thing either of them had felt in years. "Coffee again?" Ryan asked, almost against his own will. "Same diner, tomorrow. Not because you're my employer's employer or whatever legal nonsense connects us, because I want to." Victoria smiled, and it wasn't the practiced CEO smile she gave to donors and reporters. It was smaller, realer, the kind of smile that surprised her own face by showing up. "Tomorrow," she agreed. Neither of them noticed the man in the parked sedan across the street, watching through a long lens camera, who had been hired 3 days earlier by Damian Cross to document exactly this kind of moment. Over the following 2 weeks, something neither of them planned for began to take shape, slow and careful, built entirely out of small moments neither one would have called romantic if pressed, but which added up to something that felt unmistakably like falling. Ryan started telling her things he didn't tell anyone. About the mission in Syria that still woke him up at 3 a.m, sweating, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. About the day he found out his wife Sarah had died, not from a commanding officer, not from a chaplain, but from a text message from his mother-in-law that simply read, "Call me now," sent while he was 40 feet underwater during a training exercise, a message he didn't see for 6 hours. About the guilt of being a hero to strangers and a stranger to his own daughter for the first 2 years of her life, deployment after deployment stacking up while Sarah held everything together alone, and how becoming her sole parent after her death had felt less like a tragedy and more like a debt finally coming due. "I walked away from a promotion," he told Victoria one evening, sitting on a bench near the harbor, the city lights reflecting off water that had nearly killed her weeks earlier. "Command wanted me to take a position that would have made me a lot of things. Legendary, probably, if you care about that kind of word. I turned it down, told them I had a 6-year-old who needed her father home more than the Navy needed another SEAL commander. Do you regret it? Every single day I look at Lily's face and I don't." He said it without hesitation, the closest thing to certainty Victoria had ever heard from anyone about anything. That's the trade. You don't get to have both. Nobody tells you that when you sign up. You think you can be everything to everyone. You can't. Eventually, you have to choose, and I chose her. Victoria in turn told him things she had never said out loud to another human being, not to Marcus, not to her therapist, not even fully to herself. About her father who had built the company and then spent Victoria's entire childhood too consumed by it to notice she existed, and how she had spent 30 years chasing his approval by becoming exactly the kind of relentless, hollowed-out executive he had been, only to realize standing at his deathbed 11 years ago that he had never once told her he was proud of her and never would now. About how every relationship she'd had since had failed for the same reason: men who wanted her money, her name, her influence, but never once seemed to want the tired, uncertain woman underneath the title. "I thought loneliness was just the cost of doing business," she admitted one night, her voice smaller than Ryan had ever heard it. "I thought everyone at my level felt this way, isolated, surrounded by people and completely alone." "You don't have to feel that way anymore," Ryan said. "Not around me." It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a kiss, not that night. It was just a quiet, honest sentence from a man who had spent his entire life saying only true things, and it landed in Victoria's chest with more weight than any romantic gesture she'd ever received from anyone with money to spend. The first time Lily met Victoria, it wasn't planned. Ryan had asked Victoria to meet him at his small house near the base to drop off some paperwork for the research vessel contract. An excuse they both silently understood to spend an extra hour together, and Lily, home early from a canceled after-school program, was sitting on the front porch steps with a coloring book when Victoria's car pulled into the driveway. "Who's that?" Lily asked her father the moment Victoria stepped out, her small voice carrying none of the caution adults learn to layer over curiosity. Ryan froze for half a second, clearly caught between 3 years of careful boundaries and the reality standing in his driveway. "This is Miss Reynolds' sweetheart. She's a friend from work." "Are you the lady from the water?" Lily asked, looking directly at Victoria with an unnerving 6-year-old bluntness. "Daddy talks about you sometimes. He doesn't think I hear him on the phone, but I do." Victoria felt something crack open in her chest, warm and terrifying at once. She crouched down to Lily's eye level, the way she'd seen careful adults do in movies, though she had no real practice of her own. "I am the lady from the water," Victoria said. "Your dad saved my life. He's pretty amazing, you know." "I know," Lily said matter-of-factly, like this was the most obvious fact in the universe. "He's a superhero. He just doesn't wear a cape because capes get caught on things." Victoria laughed real unguarded, the kind of laugh that surprised her own throat. That's very practical. Do you want to see my coloring book? I'm doing a dinosaur, but I ran out of green, so his tail is purple. I would love to see your purple-tailed dinosaur. Ryan stood in the doorway watching this unfold, with an expression Victoria couldn't quite read. Somewhere between panic and something that looked, if she wasn't imagining it, dangerously close to hope. He didn't stop it. He didn't intervene. He just watched his daughter pull Victoria Reynolds, CEO of a billion-dollar defense company, down onto the porch steps to critique dinosaur anatomy for 20 minutes, and something in his chest that had been clenched shut for 3 years loosened just slightly for the first time since Sarah died. That night, after Victoria left, Lily climbed into Ryan's lap on the couch and asked the question he'd been dreading since the moment Victoria stepped out of her car. "Daddy, is Ms. Reynolds going to be my mommy?" Ryan's throat tightened. "I don't know, sweetheart. It's complicated." Grown-ups always say that. Lily yawned, already half asleep against his shoulder. "But she made you smile the whole time she was here. You don't smile like that. Not since Mommy." Ryan didn't answer. He just held his daughter tighter, staring at the dark television screen, terrified of how much truth had just come out of a 6-year-old's mouth. The photograph that would change everything was taken 11 days later at the charity gala, honoring military families, the same annual event coincidentally where Victoria's near drowning had happened 1 year earlier. Except this time the storm was calmer, and the danger came from somewhere else entirely. Ryan had come as Victoria's guest, dressed in a suit borrowed for the occasion, standing slightly stiff and out of place among a room full of donors who spoke a language of stock options and philanthropic tax write-offs he didn't share. Victoria had spent the first hour glued to his side, introducing him simply as a friend, a description that fooled absolutely no one who watched the way she looked at him. Near the end of the evening, on the same dock where they'd first met, Ryan reached over and adjusted a loose strand of hair that had fallen across Victoria's face, an unconscious tender gesture that meant nothing scandalous and everything intimate. A photographer, one of Damien Cross's hired men, positioned exactly where he needed to be captured, the moment perfectly. Ryan's hand near Victoria's face, her eyes closed slightly. Both of them lit gold by the string lights over the dock, looking to any stranger scrolling past, exactly like a husband and wife sharing a quiet moment at a party. Within 6 hours, the photo was everywhere. CEO Victoria Reynolds and Navy husband share tender moment at charity gala, read one headline. Another more direct, Reynolds Defense, CEO, secretly married to decorated Navy SEAL. Victoria saw it first the next morning, scrolling through her phone before her alarm had even finished ringing. Her stomach dropping as she read caption after caption calling Ryan her husband, speculating about a secret wedding, inventing a timeline of romance that had never actually happened the way the internet was describing it. She should have corrected it immediately. A single statement, "Ryan Mitchell is not my husband. He is a friend. Please respect our privacy," would have ended it within a day. She drafted that statement 3 separate times that morning, her fingers hovering over the send button on the company's official account. She never sent it, because somewhere underneath the panic of watching her private life explode across headlines, something else was happening that she wasn't ready to examine for the first time since she'd met Ryan Mitchell. The world was finally seeing him the way she saw him. Not as a soldier, not as a decorated SEAL whose classified missions would eventually leak and turn him into a symbol instead of a man. Not as a widowed single father whom people would either pity or lionize the moment they learned his story. They were seeing him simply as a man loved by someone. And after 3 years of being defined only by his losses, his wife, his career trajectory, his old life, Victoria realized that Ryan had never once in the months she'd known him been seen as anything but a tragedy, wearing a uniform. She wasn't ready to take that away from him yet. Not even to protect herself. What she didn't know, sitting in her office that morning, staring at the unsent correction, was that Damien Cross was already 3 steps ahead of her, holding a folder of documents that would soon expose far more than a misunderstood photograph documents that would force Ryan's entire classified military past into the light, threaten everything he had built to protect his daughter's ordinary life, and put Victoria in a position where silence would no longer be a choice she was allowed to make. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. Damien had already sent the invitations, and somewhere across the city, in a house with a coloring book full of purple-tailed dinosaurs, a 6-year-old girl was about to ask her father a question that neither of them was prepared to answer honestly. "Daddy," Lily would say 3 days later, holding up her tablet with the viral photograph glowing on the screen. "The news says you're married to Ms. Reynolds. Is that true?" And Ryan Mitchell, a man who had faced down enemy fire in 3 countries without flinching, who had pulled a woman back from the edge of a harbor without a second's hesitation, who had buried his wife and rebuilt an entire life around the fierce, quiet promise to never let his daughter feel alone, would find himself for the first time in his career completely unable to answer. Ryan Mitchell had faced enemy fire in 3 countries without his hands shaking. He had carried wounded men across open ground under a sky lit up with tracer rounds. He had made decisions in half a second that meant the difference between someone's son coming home and someone's son not coming home. And none of it, not 1 second of any of it, had prepared him for the way his chest tightened when his 6-year-old daughter looked up at him from the couch, with the tablet glowing in her small hands, the viral photograph still burning on the screen, and asked him if he was married. "Lily," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "Where did you see that? Everybody's talking about it at school." She said it simply the way children say things that adults spend years learning to dress up in softer language. "Emma's mom showed my teacher. My teacher looked at me funny all day." "So is it true? Are you married to her?" Ryan set down the dish towel he'd been holding, the sound of the kitchen faucet still running behind him, and lowered himself onto the couch beside his daughter. He had rehearsed 100 answers to 100 hard questions in his life. How to tell a mother her son wasn't coming home. How to explain a classified mission to a congressional committee without saying anything at all. And in this moment, sitting 3 feet from the only person in the world whose trust actually terrified him. To lose every rehearsed answer abandoned him at once. "No," he said finally. "I'm not married to Ms. Reynolds." "Then why does the picture look like that?" "Because sometimes pictures don't tell the whole story, sweetheart. Sometimes people take a picture of 1 second, and that 1 second doesn't mean what everybody decides it means." Lily considered this with the grave seriousness only a child can bring to an adult problem. "But you like her. I can tell. You laugh different when she's here." Ryan didn't answer right away. He reached over and turned off the tablet screen, not because he wanted to hide anything from her, but because he needed a second where the photograph wasn't between them, glowing accusingly, forcing him to explain something he hadn't fully explained to himself yet. "I do like her," he admitted quietly. "That doesn't mean we're married. It doesn't mean anything's decided. Grown-up things take time, Lily. More time than a picture on the internet gives you credit for." "Is she going to leave?" Like everybody says grown-ups do when things get hard. The question landed harder than any of the others. Ryan pulled his daughter into his side, felt her small body relax against him, the way it had every night since Sarah died, and he stared at the dark television screen for a long moment before he trusted himself to answer. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I know I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens with anybody else, that part doesn't change. You understand me?" Lily nodded against his chest, already half asleep. The crisis of the day dissolving the way crises do for children who trust the ground beneath them, even when the ground is shaking. Ryan sat there long after her breathing evened out, holding her, staring at his own reflection in the blank screen, and for the first time since the gala, he let himself feel the full weight of what was coming. Because 3 miles across the city, in a glass office on the 14th floor, Victoria Reynolds was standing over a folder Marcus Webb had just placed on her desk, and the name printed across the top of the first page, in bold official lettering, was Ryan's. "Where did you get this?" Victoria's voice was low, controlled the voice she used in negotiations when she already knew she was losing ground and refused to let anyone see it. Marcus stood on the other side of the desk, his expression grim in a way she'd only seen twice before in 15 years. Once when her father died, and once during the merger collapse that nearly bankrupted the company. "It came through Damien's office," Marcus said. "Officially, it's part of a due diligence packet for Monday's board meeting. Unofficially, it reads like an ambush. He's had someone digging into Mitchell's service record for weeks, Victoria. Long before that photo ever went viral." Victoria opened the folder with hands that did not shake, because she had spent 30 years training them not to, and began reading words that made the floor tilt beneath her anyway. Classified operation designations blacked out, but their outlines still visible through redacted summaries. A commendation for valor under fire that had never been publicly released. A tactical designation that, when she searched it later that night, connected Ryan to a mission in Syria so sensitive that even its existence had been denied for 3 years by 2 separate administrations. He hadn't just been a SEAL. He had been one of the most decorated tactical commanders the Navy had produced in a decade, on track for a position so high in the command structure that men twice his age competed for it before he'd walked away from all of it to raise a daughter who thought her father sold furniture for a living. "He never told me any of this," Victoria said quietly, more to herself than to Marcus. "Would you have told anyone if you were him?" Marcus asked. "A file like this doesn't just make him impressive, Victoria. It makes him a target. For reporters for foreign intelligence, curiosity for every enemy his old unit ever made. He buried this because burying it was the only way to keep his daughter's life ordinary. And Damien is about to drag every page of it into a public board meeting." Victoria closed the folder slowly, her mind already 3 steps ahead, calculating angles the way she'd been trained to since she was 25 years old and inherited a company that expected her to fail. Why would Damien do this? What does exposing Ryan's record actually get him? "It gets him a narrative," Marcus said. CEO, recklessly involved with a man whose classified past creates security liability for a defense contractor. It gets him a reason to call an emergency vote on your leadership. And if the board believes even half of what he's about to present Victoria, he doesn't need much more than that. Victoria sat down slowly in her chair, the weight of the folder still sitting on the desk between them, like something radioactive. Outside her window, the harbor stretched out gray and indifferent, the same water that had nearly killed her 4 months earlier. The same water where Ryan had first told her he had a daughter who thought courage meant explaining furniture sales. "He's going to lose everything he built for her," Victoria said. "The one thing he wanted, the only thing he wanted, was for Lily to have a normal life. And I'm the reason that's about to be taken from her." "You didn't leak this file." "No, but I let this relationship become public enough that someone could dig for it. I told myself I was protecting something good by staying quiet at that gala, instead of correcting the story. I told myself the world seeing him as a man instead of a soldier mattered more than the risk." Her voice cracked just slightly, the first crack Marcus had heard in her composure in years. "I was wrong. I put a target on a little girl's father because I didn't want to give up a feeling." "You didn't do anything wrong by caring about him, Victoria. Tell that to Damien when he stands up Monday morning." Ryan found out about the board meeting the same way he found out about most things in Victoria's world too late, and from someone other than her. A former unit contact, a man who still had connections inside defense intelligence circles, called him at 11 at night with a warning that made Ryan's blood run cold. "Somebody's been asking questions about the Al-Rashid operation," the voice on the phone said. "Your name specifically, not through official channels, through a corporate research firm hired by a private company." Ryan sat at his kitchen table in the dark, phone pressed against his ear, staring at the refrigerator covered in Lily's drawing stick figures, holding hands under a yellow crayon sun, a dinosaur with a purple tail that Victoria had complimented weeks earlier. "Reynolds' defense," Ryan said, already knowing the answer before his contact confirmed it. "You need to understand what you're dealing with, Ryan. That file, if it goes public even partially, doesn't just embarrass you. It puts eyes on people who were part of that operation. It puts eyes on your daughter. You need to think very carefully about who you're letting into your life right now. Ryan hung up the phone and sat alone in the dark kitchen for a long time. The house silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and Lily's soft breathing down the hall. He thought about the promise he'd made himself the night Sarah died, that he would never again let his job, his past, his choices, put his daughter in danger. He thought about the promotion he'd walked away from, the commendations he'd refused to accept publicly, the entire careful architecture he'd built around Lily's ordinary life, brick by brick for 3 years. And he thought about Victoria standing in that stairwell 4 months ago, asking him if she could meet his daughter, and the way he'd said no, and the way she'd shown up anyway with a stuffed rabbit and a stubbornness that matched his own. He drove to her building at 6 the next morning before the sun was fully up, before her assistant had arrived, and found her already at her desk, the folder still open in front of her, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept either. "You knew about this before I did," Ryan said, not a question. Victoria looked up, and whatever composure she'd worn for Marcus the day before had thinned considerably by morning. "I found out yesterday afternoon. I was going to call you. When, after the board meeting, decided my daughter's life for her. Ryan, do you understand what you've done?" His voice wasn't raised, but it carried a controlled intensity that was somehow worse than shouting the voice of a man who had spent years managing rage in situations where losing control got people killed. "I buried that operation. I buried my own career on purpose, so that nobody would ever look at Lily and see a target instead of a little girl. And in 4 months you've undone 3 years of that. I never went looking for that information. Damien dug it up to use as a weapon against me, not against you. It doesn't matter who dug it up. It matters that it exists now in a folder sitting on a boardroom table, about to be read out loud in front of people who have no idea what that operation actually cost, what it actually means for the men who were part of it." Ryan ran a hand over his face, and for the first time since Victoria had met him, she watched something that looked dangerously close to fear pass across his features. "I told you at that coffee shop the very first week. I told you my daughter doesn't need to get attached to complications. You said this wasn't a complication." "I was wrong," Victoria said quietly. "I knew I was wrong the moment I saw that folder. I have spent my entire life believing that as long as I was careful enough, controlled enough, smart enough, I could manage every risk in front of me. And I let myself believe that applied to you too. That I could have you have Lily's dinosaur drawings, have coffee at 6 in the morning without it costing either of us anything." Her voice caught, and she looked away from him toward the window toward the harbor. "It's costing you everything. I understand if you can't forgive that." Ryan was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working the anger in him, fighting against something else, something that had been building in him for 4 months, despite every instinct telling him to protect himself and his daughter from exactly this kind of exposure. "I'm not walking away because I'm angry at you," he said finally. "I'm angry at the situation. I'm angry that a man I've never even met decided my daughter's safety was worth less than his ambition. But I need you to understand something, Victoria. If that board meeting goes the way it's about to go, if my record gets read into a public transcript, I don't just lose my privacy. Men I served with lose theirs. Families of men who didn't come home from that operation could have details exposed they were never supposed to know. This isn't just about me." "I know. So, what are you going to do about it?" Victoria met his eyes, and something settled in her expression. Not the CEO mask, not the composed armor she wore into every negotiation, but something rawer, more determined. "I'm going to walk into that boardroom Monday morning, and I'm going to make sure that folder never gets read out loud. Whatever it costs me." The weekend before the board meeting passed in a blur of closed-door strategy sessions, phone calls to lawyers, and a growing dread that settled over Reynolds Defense's executive floor like fog rolling in off the harbor. Marcus worked through Saturday and Sunday compiling every legal argument he could find for why classified military records could not under any circumstances be entered into a corporate board record without violating federal security statutes. "It's not enough," Victoria said. Sunday night, pacing her office in sweatpants, hair pulled back, 3 empty coffee cups scattered across her desk. Damien doesn't need to actually read classified specifics into the record. He just needs to gesture at their existence. He needs the board to hear the word classified and the phrase security liability in the same sentence as my name. That's enough to trigger a no-confidence vote. Then we control the narrative before he does, Marcus said. You get in front of it. You address it directly on your terms before he can frame it on his. And say that I'm dating a man whose past I can't discuss, whose record I only partially understand myself, and that the board should trust my judgment anyway. Say the truth. That's usually worked out for you before. Victoria stopped pacing and looked at him. The truth is that I let a story about a photograph stand uncorrected because some selfish part of me liked watching the world finally see Ryan the way I see him. The truth is, that decision may have put a Navy SEAL's former unit and his 6-year-old daughter's safety at risk. That's not a truth that inspires confidence, Marcus. That's a truth that gets CEOs removed. Maybe. Or maybe it's a truth that shows the board exactly who you are underneath the title. Someone who made a mistake because she cared about someone and who's willing to stand in front of a room and own it instead of hiding behind a legal team. Marcus closed his laptop, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. You've spent 15 years being unbeatable in that boardroom, Victoria. Maybe this time the winning move isn't being unbeatable. Maybe it's being honest. Victoria didn't sleep that night. She sat in the dark of her apartment, the same folder from Damien's office spread across her coffee table, alongside pages of prepared remarks she kept writing and tearing up, until somewhere around 3 in the morning, her phone buzzed with a text from Ryan. Can't sleep either. Lily asked me tonight if I was scared. I told her no. I lied to my own daughter for the first time in 3 years. Victoria stared at the message for a long time before she typed back. What are you scared of? The reply came slower this time, like he'd needed to think about the honest answer. Losing the life I built for her. But more than that. Losing you before I even figured out what having you actually means. Victoria read the message 4 times before she set the phone down, walked to her window, and stood looking out at the dark harbor until the sky began to lighten toward Monday morning. Char. The boardroom on the 14th floor had hosted 100 difficult meetings in Victoria's tenure, hostile takeover attempts, quarterly disasters, the merger collapse that had nearly ended the company entirely. None of them had felt like this. 11 board members sat around the long mahogany table folders in front of each of them. The tension in the room thick enough that Victoria could feel it pressing against her chest the moment she walked through the door. Damien Cross sat near the head of the table, a folder identical to the one Marcus had shown her 3 days earlier positioned neatly in front of him, his expression carefully arranged into something that looked like reluctant concern rather than triumph, though Victoria had known him long enough to see through the performance immediately. Victoria, he said, standing as she entered, extending a handshake. She declined by simply walking past him to her own seat. I want to say before we begin that nothing about today is personal. The board has a fiduciary obligation to address matters that affect the company's security posture and public perception. That's all this is. Save it, Damien. We both know what today is. The board chair, an older man named Harold Whitfield, who had served on the board since Victoria's father ran the company, called the meeting to order with visible discomfort. Victoria, Mr. Cross, has requested time to present findings related to a personal matter that he believes carries corporate implications. Given the sensitivity, I'm going to allow it, but I want it on record that this board values your leadership, and this is not at this stage a formal action against you. Understood, Victoria said, though her eyes never left Damien. Damien stood, opened his folder with the theatrical precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment for weeks, and began. 4 months ago, our CEO was photographed at a company charity event with a man later identified as Lieutenant Commander Ryan Mitchell, a former Navy SEAL with an extensive classified service record. Since that photograph went viral, media speculation has centered on a supposed relationship between Ms. Reynolds and Mr. Mitchell, a relationship Ms. Reynolds has notably never publicly denied. He clicked forward through a slide presentation. The redacted summary of Ryan's service record, projected onto the screen at the end of the room, blacked out lines and classification stamps visible even through the redactions. What concerns this board, Damien continued, is not Ms. Reynolds' personal life. It is the fact that Mr. Mitchell's classified background creates a documented security exposure for a company whose primary business is defense contracting. Foreign intelligence services actively monitor personal relationships of executives at companies like ours. A public unaddressed relationship with a man carrying this level of classified exposure represents at minimum a failure of judgment. At worst, it represents a genuine liability to every contract this company holds with the Department of Defense. Victoria felt every eye in the room turn toward her. She had rehearsed a dozen responses over the weekend. Legal arguments, procedural objections, careful statements crafted by lawyers to minimize damage. She looked at the blacked-out slide on the screen. Thought about Lily's stuffed rabbit sitting on a shelf in a house 3 miles away. Thought about Ryan's text message at 3 in the morning and set aside every rehearsed line she'd prepared. "May I respond?" she asked Whitfield. "Please." Victoria buttoned her blazer and looked directly at Damien before turning to address the rest of the table. "Everything Mr. Cross just told you is technically true and completely misleading, and I think it's important the board understands the difference." She walked toward the projection screen close enough that the redacted document glowed against her blazer. "Yes, I've been seeing a man named Ryan Mitchell for 4 months. Yes, he has a classified service record. No, I have never seen the unredacted contents of that record, and neither has Mr. Cross, because neither of us has clearance to see it. What you're looking at on this screen is black boxes and speculation dressed up as a security briefing." "Victoria," Damien started. "I'm not finished." Her voice sharpened the boardroom voice, the one that had closed 9-figure deals and survived 3 attempted takeovers. "What I can tell you is who Ryan Mitchell actually is, because unlike Mr. Cross, I've spent 4 months getting to know the man behind that folder, instead of paying a research firm to dig through his past for ammunition. He is a widowed father raising a 6-year-old daughter alone. He turned down a command promotion, a promotion, gentlemen, that men spend entire careers competing for, because he made a promise to his daughter that he would come home every night instead of chasing rank. He has never once in 4 months asked me for anything related to this company, this board, or my money. He didn't know who I was when he pulled me out of the water at that gala. He still honestly mostly doesn't care." She turned back to face Damien directly. "You want to talk about security risk. Let's talk about the actual risk in this room. The risk isn't a decorated veteran raising his daughter in peace. The risk is a board member who hired a private firm to illegally dig into classified military records for the sole purpose of a corporate power play, potentially exposing operational details that could put currently serving personnel in danger. That's not a hypothetical liability, Damien. That's the actual crime being committed in this room right now." The room went completely silent. Whitfield's expression had shifted from discomfort to something closer to alarm. "That's a serious allegation," Whitfield said carefully. "It's a serious situation," Victoria replied. "I'd like the board's legal counsel to review exactly how Mr. Cross's research firm obtained access to redacted military files, because I guarantee you it wasn't through any channel this company is legally permitted to use. And I'd like it on record that I refuse to allow one more page of that folder to be discussed in this room, because every page risks the safety of men who served this country and had nothing to do with corporate politics." Damien's composure finally cracked a flash of genuine anger breaking through the careful performance. "You're deflecting from the real issue, Victoria. Your judgment, your personal choices affecting this company's reputation and security." "My judgment," Victoria said, "is exactly what's kept this company profitable for 15 years. Through a merger collapse, you actively tried to sabotage through 3 takeover attempts. You were suspiciously well positioned to benefit from. If this board wants to question my judgment, I'd welcome a full and transparent review starting with Mr. Cross's activities over the past several years, not just the past several weeks. Whitfield looked between them for a long moment before addressing the table. I think, given the seriousness of what's just been raised, we need to table this discussion and consult legal counsel before proceeding further. Mr. Cross, I'd ask you to provide full documentation of how this research was conducted immediately. Damien's face went pale, the confident posture from the beginning of the meeting evaporating entirely. He gathered his folder with hands that were no longer entirely steady, and for the first time since Victoria had known him, he looked less like a predator and more like a man who had badly miscalculated the strength of the thing he'd tried to attack. The meeting ended without a vote. It ended without Ryan's classified record being read into any official transcript. But as Victoria walked out of the boardroom, her legs finally allowing themselves to shake now that no one was watching, she understood this wasn't over. Damien Cross did not lose gracefully, and a man who had spent years quietly hiring investigators wasn't going to disappear because one meeting hadn't gone his way. She drove straight from the office to Ryan's house that evening, still in her boardroom blazer, still running on adrenaline, and no sleep, and found him sitting on the front porch steps in the fading light, Lily's bicycle overturned in the yard beside him. "How did it go?" he asked, standing as she approached, searching her face for the answer before she could give it. "Your record stayed sealed. I made sure of it." "How?" Victoria sat down heavily on the porch step, exhaustion finally catching up to her all at once. "By telling the truth about who you actually are instead of letting Damien tell a lie about what you represent. It worked. This time." Ryan sat down beside her close enough that their shoulders touched, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, "for how I talked to you Friday morning. You were trying to protect me, and I came at you like you'd betrayed me. You weren't wrong to be angry. I put your daughter's safety at risk because I liked the way it felt to have something real for once. That's not an excuse. That's just true. Lily asked me again tonight if you were leaving." Ryan's voice was quiet, careful, like he was testing weight on ice he wasn't sure would hold. "I didn't know what to tell her this time either." Victoria turned to look at him, the porch light catching the exhaustion and something else in his face. Something that looked like a question he hadn't fully worked up the courage to ask yet. "Tell her I'm not going anywhere," Victoria said. "Tell her that a man threatened everything I've built to try to force me out of my own company, and I stood in that room and chose you anyway. That's not the kind of choice people make by accident, Ryan. That's the kind of choice people make when they already know exactly what they're choosing." Ryan reached over and took her hand, his fingers rough and steady around hers, and for the first time since the photograph had gone viral, since the folder had landed on her desk, since 3 years of careful controlled distance had started quietly dissolving between them, neither one of them pulled away. "Damien's not finished," Ryan said. "Men like that don't lose once and disappear." "No?" Victoria agreed. "He's not finished, but neither are we." Inside the house through the screen door, Lily's small silhouette appeared in the hallway light, watching the two of them sitting together on the porch steps in the dark. Her father's hand wrapped around a hand that wasn't her mother's, but had started slowly, and without either adult's full permission, to feel like something that belonged in their lives anyway. She didn't say anything. She just watched for a long moment, then quietly padded back toward her room, satisfied by something she couldn't fully name, but understood completely, in the simple, uncomplicated way children understand the things that matter. Behind them, in an office building across the city, Damien Cross sat alone at his desk long after the rest of the floor had emptied, staring at a legal notice that had already arrived from the board's counsel, demanding full disclosure of his research methods, and began making a phone call to a man whose name did not appear on any official company record at all, a man who had access to information about Ryan Mitchell's past that went far beyond anything a corporate research firm could have legally obtained on its own. The man Damien called did not answer on the first ring or the second, and when he finally picked up, his voice carried the flat, unhurried tone of someone who had spent a career making sure nothing ever caught him by surprise. "You said this would be clean," the voice said. "Corporate research public records. Nothing that traces back to anyone but a private investigator with a paper trail your lawyers could disown. Instead, I'm reading a legal notice with my associate's fingerprints on it. The board's lawyer is bluffing, Damien said, though the certainty in his own voice sounded thinner than it had that morning. They don't actually know how the file was obtained. They're hoping I'll panic and confess something. Are you panicking? Damien didn't answer right away, and the silence on the line told the other man everything he needed to know. Listen to me carefully, the voice continued. What I gave you was a summary, a shadow of the actual record. If you want something that actually ends this, something that removes Victoria Reynolds from that company permanently and removes Mitchell from her life at the same time, I can get you more. The real operational details, not redacted, not summarized. The kind of information that doesn't just embarrass a man, it makes him radioactive to every institution he's ever trusted. That's illegal. Everything we've done since the day you hired me has been illegal, Mr. Cross. The only question that matters now is whether you want to finish what you started, or whether you want to spend the next decade wondering if Victoria Reynolds ever finds out exactly how deep you were willing to go to take her company from her. Damien sat in his dark office for a long time after the call ended, staring at his own reflection in the window overlooking the harbor, and made the decision that would define the rest of the story he was about to become part of. Victoria didn't find out about the second leak from Marcus, or from her legal team, or from any of the careful institutional channels that had warned her the first time. She found out from a phone call at 11 at night, 4 days after the board meeting, from a national news producer requesting comment on a story scheduled to air the following morning, a story that used words like classified extraction, operation, Syrian informant network, compromised, and civilian casualties, disputed words that had never appeared anywhere in the redacted summary Damien had presented to the board. I need you to tell me this isn't real, Victoria said into the phone, standing in her kitchen at midnight. Marcus already on speaker from his own apartment. Both of them scrambling through emergency channels that existed for exactly this kind of catastrophe and had never actually been used. It's real, Marcus said grimly, the sound of him typing furious in the background. Someone leaked far beyond what Damien originally had. This isn't corporate research anymore, Victoria. This is a genuine unauthorized disclosure of classified military information. Whoever did this broke federal law, not corporate policy. Can we stop the story? We can try to delay it with legal injunctions, but injunctions take time we don't have. It airs at 6 a.m., unless something changes between now and then. Victoria hung up and called Ryan immediately. Her hands shaking for the first time in the entire ordeal, the calm control she'd maintained through the boardroom, finally cracking under the weight of what was coming. He answered on the second ring, already awake, already knowing something was wrong from the hour alone. Victoria, there's a story running tomorrow morning, national news. It has details about the Syrian operation that go beyond anything Damien presented at the board meeting. Real details, Ryan. Operational specifics. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Victoria thought the call had dropped. When Ryan finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. Dropped into something flat and controlled that she recognized instantly as the sound of a man forcing himself not to feel what he was feeling, because feeling it wouldn't help anyone right now. What specifics? Extraction details. Something about a compromised informant network. Disputed casualty numbers. Victoria's voice broke slightly. I don't fully understand what any of it means, Ryan, but I know it's not supposed to be public. I know men could be in danger because of this. They could be dead because of this. Ryan's voice was quiet, almost hollow. If that network's exposed, if anyone on the ground who worked with us during that operation gets identified, they don't get arrested, Victoria. They get executed. Their families get executed. This isn't a PR problem. This is a body count problem. I'm calling everyone I know. The company's legal team government contacts anyone who might have leverage to stop this before it airs. It won't be enough. Ryan's voice carried a certainty that terrified her more than panic would have. Once a network's been given to a national newsroom, there's no putting it back. The story existing at all means someone already has the information. Killing the broadcast doesn't undo the fact that it's already out there, already potentially in front of people who'd use it. Then what do we do? There was a long pause. I need to make some calls. People who might still be able to warn the network on the ground before the broadcast even airs, give them time to disappear if they need to. I need to do this alone, Victoria. Let me help. You can't help with this part. His voice wasn't cruel, but it was final. A door closing gently, but completely. This is the part of my life I never wanted anywhere near yours. This is exactly what I was trying to protect Lily from. And now it's happening anyway. He hung up before she could respond, and Victoria stood alone in her kitchen at nearly 1 a.m, the phone silent in her hand, understanding for the first time the true size of the thing she had accidentally invited into both of their lives. The broadcast aired at 6 a.m., exactly as scheduled, and by 7, Ryan Mitchell's name was trending across every major platform in the country, no longer attached to a charming rescue story or a viral photograph, but to a controversy that painted him, depending on which outlet a person trusted, as either a hero whose sacrifice had been unfairly exposed, or a dangerous operative whose actions had left disputed casualties in his wake. Reynolds Defense's stock dropped 4% before the opening bell. Victoria's phone did not stop ringing from the moment she woke up. Journalists, board members, government relations, contacts, all of them wanting a statement she did not yet know how to give. She found Ryan not at his house, where reporters had already begun gathering outside by mid-morning, but at a small municipal park 3 blocks away, sitting alone on a bench with his phone in his hand. Lily beside him in her school uniform, having been pulled out of class early after another parent recognized her walking in that morning, and began filming. They followed us, Ryan said when Victoria approached his voice carrying an exhaustion that went beyond sleep deprivation into something closer to defeat. Cameras outside the school, outside the house. My daughter got pulled out of her second-grade classroom because some man wanted a photo of the SEAL's kid. Lily sat pressed against her father's side. Unusually quiet, her small hands wrapped tightly around a granola bar she wasn't eating. Ryan, I am so sorry. Don't. He didn't look at her. I need you to understand something, and I need you to actually hear it this time. This isn't a corporate crisis you can fix with a good statement and a legal team. This is my life. This is my daughter's face on the internet next to headlines calling her father a war criminal because some outlet needed a controversial angle. You didn't cause the leak, but you're the reason my life became public enough for someone to want to leak it in the first place. Victoria felt each word land like something physical. So what are you saying? Ryan finally looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen from him before. Not anger, not the controlled intensity from Friday morning, but something raw and unguarded and deeply afraid. I'm saying I don't know if I can keep doing this. Not because of how I feel about you, because of what it's costing her. He nodded toward Lily, who had gone very still beside him, listening in the way children listen when they understand something important is happening, even if they don't fully grasp the words. I promised her a normal life. I promised myself I'd never let my job put her in danger again. And in 4 months, everything I built to protect that promise has come apart. Daddy, Lily said quietly, tugging at his sleeve, is this because of Ms. Reynolds? The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. Exactly the kind of question only a child could ask, without any protective softening around it. Ryan looked down at his daughter, and something in his face crumpled slightly before he caught it. No, sweetheart, this isn't her fault. This is about some things from before you were born. Grown-up things. Complicated things. But if she wasn't here, would the cameras be here too? Victoria felt the question like a blow, because it was the question she had been avoiding asking herself since the phone call at 11 the night before, and hearing it from a 6-year-old made it impossible to keep avoiding any longer. No, Victoria said quietly, before Ryan could answer for her. Probably not, sweetheart. I'm sorry. This is partly because of me. Lily studied her for a long moment, with the same unnerving directness she'd shown the first day they met on the porch. "Are you going to go away now? So the cameras go away too?" The question was innocent, and it was also. Victoria realized with a sick feeling in her stomach exactly the question that would determine the next several minutes of her life, possibly the next several years. "I don't know," Victoria admitted. "I don't want to. But I also don't want to be the reason you can't have a normal life anymore." Ryan stood abruptly, lifting Lily's backpack from the bench, his jaw tight with the particular kind of control Victoria now recognized as the sign he was holding something enormous just beneath the surface. "I need to get her somewhere safe. Somewhere the cameras can't follow. I can't do this conversation right now, Victoria. Not with her sitting right here. When can we talk?" "I don't know." He took Lily's hand, and for a moment he looked back at Victoria with an expression that carried more grief than anger, more fear than blame. "I need to figure out how to protect my daughter first. Everything else comes after that." She watched them walk away across the park, Lily glancing back once over her shoulder with an expression Victoria couldn't quite read, and stood alone on the gravel path, feeling for the first time in her adult life completely powerless to fix a problem with money, influence, or strategy. Damien Cross watched the news coverage from his office with a satisfaction that curdled over the course of the morning into something closer to unease. He had wanted Victoria destabilized. He had wanted Ryan Mitchell removed as a variable in her life. He had not, whatever he told himself in the moments after the first phone call, actually wanted to be responsible for putting a child's face on national television or endangering an active intelligence network on the other side of the world. His phone rang. The board's outside counsel. "Mr. Cross, we need you to come in immediately. Federal investigators have opened an inquiry into the unauthorized disclosure of classified information related to the Mitchell story. Given your documented involvement in the initial research into his service record, you're going to want representation present for any conversation that happens next. Federal investigators." Damien repeated the words, landing with a weight he hadn't fully anticipated when he'd made a phone call in a dark office 4 days earlier, looking for leverage instead of consequences. "Yes, Mr. Cross. This is no longer a corporate matter. This is a criminal one." Damien hung up the phone and sat very still in his office chair. The ambition that had driven him for 8 years, suddenly looking in the cold light of federal scrutiny like something closer to recklessness than strategy. He had wanted Victoria's company. He had gotten instead a front-row seat to watching that ambition metastasize into something that could end with him in a courtroom instead of a corner office. He picked up the phone again and called the same unlisted number from 4 nights earlier. It rang 8 times before going to a message stating the number was no longer in service. Whoever had provided the leaked information had already disappeared, leaving Damien holding the full weight of a decision he could no longer pretend was someone else's fault. So, Victoria spent the following 3 days in a version of hell entirely new to her, locked out of the 2 most important relationships developing in her life, unable to reach Ryan, who had taken Lily somewhere private and stopped answering his phone entirely, while simultaneously fielding an escalating crisis that now included federal investigators, congressional staffers requesting briefings, and a board that had gone eerily quiet in a way that felt more dangerous than open hostility. Marcus found her on the 4th night still in her office, the same blazer from the board meeting, now wrinkled beyond recognition, 3 days of exhaustion visible in a face that had spent 15 years refusing to show exhaustion in front of anyone. "You need to go home," Marcus said. "I need to find a way to fix this." "There's no fixing this, Victoria. Not the way you fix a bad quarter or a hostile takeover. This isn't a business problem anymore. It's federal. It's personal. It's a little girl who got pulled out of school by cameras because of decisions made by adults who should have known better." Marcus sat down heavily across from her desk. "The only thing you can actually control right now is what you do next and how honestly you do it. He won't answer my calls." Would you in his position? Victoria didn't answer because she already knew the truth of it. She thought about the promise Ryan had made himself the night Sarah died, the careful architecture of Lily's ordinary life he had built brick by brick for 3 years, and how completely that architecture had come apart in the span of 4 months. Because Victoria Reynolds had decided on a windy dock during a charity gala that staying silent about a photograph felt more important than protecting the people she was falling in love with. "I need to see him," Victoria said. "Not to fix anything. Just to be honest with him the way I should have been honest with myself from the very beginning." "Then go find him." It took her most of the 5th day to track down the address. A small cabin 2 hours outside the city that belonged to a fellow SEAL, Ryan had served with a place he'd clearly chosen specifically because it existed nowhere in any public record connected to his name. She drove out alone without security, without an assistant, without any of the careful protective layers she'd spent her entire adult life building around herself, and knocked on the door of a cabin she had no invitation to visit. Ryan opened the door slowly, and the look on his face when he saw her standing on the porch was unreadable. Not welcoming, not hostile, something exhausted and cautious in between. "How did you find this place?" "I hired someone good at finding things. I'm sorry. I know that's exactly the kind of overreach that got us into this mess in the first place." Ryan was quiet for a long moment, then stepped aside to let her in. Lily was asleep on a small couch near the fireplace, a blanket pulled up to her chin, looking peaceful in a way she hadn't looked in the park 3 days earlier. "She's been better out here," Ryan said quietly, following Victoria's gaze. "No cameras, no questions from other kids at school. Just quiet." He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion evident in every movement. "I've spent 3 days trying to figure out how to undo the last 4 months of my life. I can't find a way to do it that doesn't feel like giving something up that actually mattered." "You don't have to figure it out tonight," Victoria said. "I just needed you to know something, and I needed to say it to your face instead of a phone call you weren't answering." She took a breath, steadying herself the way she did before the most important negotiations of her career, except this negotiation had nothing to do with money or contracts. "If you decide this is too much, if you decide the risk to Lily outweighs whatever this is between us, I will understand completely, and I will not fight you on it. But I need you to know that I am not walking away first. Whatever comes next, investigations, more leaks, more cameras outside your door. I am staying in this unless you tell me to go." Ryan looked at her for a long moment, then glanced toward his sleeping daughter on the couch, then back at Victoria, something shifting behind his eyes. "Federal investigators called me yesterday," he said quietly. "They want to talk to me about the leak, about the operation. They think whoever did this might come after me directly to keep me quiet, or come after the informants I helped extract 3 years ago to eliminate the last risk of them ever talking." "Are you in danger?" "Possibly. I don't know yet." He exhaled slowly. "I spent 3 days out here telling myself the answer was to disappear. Take Lily somewhere nobody could find us, start over, completely cut every connection that put a target on either of us. I almost believed I could actually do it." "What stopped you?" Ryan looked at his daughter again, and something in his expression softened. "She asked me yesterday if we were running away because we did something wrong. I told her no. She said, 'Then why are we hiding like we did?' And I didn't have an answer for her. Victoria, because she was right. Hiding from this doesn't protect her. It just teaches her that when things get hard, the answer is to disappear instead of standing and dealing with it. That's not the lesson I want her to learn from me. So what do you want to do instead?" "I want to go back," Ryan said slowly, like he was working out the decision as he spoke it aloud. "I want to face the investigation honestly. I want to help identify who leaked this so it can't happen to anyone else's family the way it happened to mine. And I want to figure out honestly whether there's a version of this of us that doesn't require either one of us to disappear." Victoria felt something loosen in her chest for the first time in 5 days. "I don't have easy answers either. Damien's likely facing federal charges. The board still hasn't decided what happens to my leadership once the investigation concludes. There's a real chance I lose the company my grandfather built. Ryan, I'm not walking into anything simple by staying in this with you. I know. A small, tired smile crossed his face, the first one she'd seen in days. Guess that makes two of us walking into something complicated with our eyes open. They stood there in the quiet cabin, Lily sleeping peacefully a few feet away, both of them exhausted and uncertain, and for the first time since the leak 3 days earlier, choosing deliberately honestly, with full knowledge of exactly what it might cost them not to walk away from each other. The following week brought the federal inquiry into full motion, investigators descending on both Reynolds' defense and Damian Cross's private communications with a thoroughness that quickly revealed the full scope of what he had done. The unlisted contact who had provided the deeper leak was eventually traced through financial records to a disgraced former intelligence contractor who had been selling classified information for profit for years, using ambitious, desperate men like Damian as unwitting distribution channels for material he couldn't sell directly to foreign buyers without immediate detection. Damian was placed on administrative leave within 72 hours of the investigation opening, the board voting unanimously. Whitfield later confided to Victoria that it hadn't even required discussion to remove him from any position of authority pending the outcome of federal charges that were by every indication going to be severe. Ryan cooperated fully with investigators, providing operational context that helped identify exactly which elements of the leaked information posed genuine danger to personnel still in the field, allowing intelligence agencies to move quickly enough to relocate the most exposed members of the informant network before any of them could be identified and targeted. It was by every account Victoria later heard from people with far more security clearance than she possessed one of the fastest and most effective damage control operations anyone in that world had witnessed in years, a direct result everyone agreed of Ryan's intimate knowledge of exactly what needed protecting and exactly how fast it needed to move. The news cycle, as news cycles do, eventually shifted toward the next controversy. The next scandal, leaving behind a residue of half-formed public opinion about Ryan Mitchell that ranged from cautious admiration to lingering suspicion depending on which outlet a person had trusted during the worst of the storm. But something had changed in Victoria that the news cycle's movement onward couldn't touch. She had spent 5 days believing that the version of herself who protected people, who chose relationships over reputation, who stood in a cabin and told a frightened, exhausted man that she wasn't walking away first, was somehow separate from the version of herself who ran a billion-dollar defense company with ruthless precision. Standing in the wreckage of the worst crisis of her professional life, she understood for the first time that those two versions of herself weren't actually separate at all. They were the same woman finally allowed to exist in the same room together. She drove out to the cabin one final time the week the federal inquiry formally concluded with Damian's indictment on charges related to unauthorized disclosure of classified information and conspiracy, and found Ryan and Lily sitting on the porch steps in the late afternoon sun. Lily's coloring book spread open between them, a new dinosaur taking shape in careful, deliberate crayon strokes. "We're coming home tomorrow," Ryan said as she climbed the porch steps. "Lily wants to go back to school. Says she misses her friends more than she's scared of the cameras." "I'm brave now," Lily announced, not looking up from her coloring book. "Daddy says being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the thing anyway." Victoria smiled, sitting down on the step beside them, watching Lily's careful hand fill in the outline of a dinosaur's tail with a color that this time actually matched the rest of its body. "There's something I need to tell both of you," Victoria said, and something in her tone made Ryan look up sharply, some instinct honed by years of reading danger in a person's voice before they said the actual words. "The board asked me to hold a public statement next week once Damian's case is formally filed. They want me to address the company, address the shareholders, put the entire ordeal officially to rest." "What are you going to say?" Ryan asked carefully. Victoria looked at him, then at Lily, then back at the harbor visible in the distance beyond the cabin's tree line, and felt something settle into place inside her that had been unsettled since the very first night she'd stood on a different dock in a storm and let a stranger pull her back from the edge of the water. "I'm going to tell the truth," she said. "All of it. No more silence standing in for a decision I should have made honestly from the very beginning." Ryan held her gaze for a long moment, understanding exactly what she meant, and reached over to take her hand the same steady way he had on his own porch steps weeks earlier, before either of them knew how much the coming days would cost, or how much they'd both be willing to pay for what they'd found on the other side of it. The press room at Reynolds Defense had never been designed for a moment like this. It existed ordinarily for quarterly earnings calls and product announcements. Rows of stiff chairs facing a podium with the company's logo mounted behind it. A room built for numbers and projections, not confessions. By the morning Victoria was scheduled to speak, every seat had been filled an hour before the doors even opened. Reporters standing 3 deep along the back wall, camera operators fighting for position near the front. Marcus found her in the hallway outside, pacing in slow, deliberate circles. The prepared remarks from the legal team sitting untouched in a folder on a nearby table. "You're not using those," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "No." The board approved specific language, Victoria. Careful language. Language designed to protect the company from further liability. "I know what they approved." Victoria stopped pacing and looked at him, and something in her face had settled since the cabin, some final piece locking into place. "I'm done being careful in a way that protects everyone except the people who actually mattered through all of this." Marcus studied her for a long moment, then picked up the folder of prepared remarks and set it back down without opening it. "Then go say what you actually mean. I'll handle whatever comes after." Victoria walked into the press room at exactly 10 o'clock, the flash of cameras hitting her the moment she stepped through the door. A sound like static rain that she'd grown used to over 15 years of public life, but that felt different this time. Sharper, more consequential. She stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone with hands that were for the first time in this entire ordeal, completely steady, and looked out at a room full of people waiting for a corporate statement she had no intention of giving them. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "I know most of you came expecting a carefully worded statement about liability and corporate governance. I've been advised extensively on exactly what language to use this morning. I'm not going to use it." A ripple moved through the room, reporters exchanging glances, several phones lifting higher to catch whatever was coming. "4 months ago, a man pulled me back from the edge of a dock during a storm and saved my life. His name is Ryan Mitchell. He is a decorated Navy officer. He is a widowed father raising a 6-year-old daughter alone, and in the months since that night I fell in love with him quietly, privately, in a way I never intended to become public at all." She paused, gathering the next part, aware of exactly how much weight it carried. "When a photograph from a charity gala went viral suggesting we were married, I made a choice that I now understand was a mistake, though, not for the reasons some of you have speculated. I didn't stay silent because I was hiding something scandalous. I stayed silent because for the first time in 3 years, the world was finally seeing Ryan Mitchell as something other than a tragedy, in a uniform as simply a man, a father, someone worthy of being seen without his past defining every headline about him. I liked that. I let that feeling matter more than honesty, and it put people I care about in danger." She looked directly at the cameras, now her voice steady, but carrying an emotion she made no attempt to hide. "Ryan Mitchell is not my husband. I want to say that plainly because plain truth is something I owe everyone in this room after weeks of speculation. But he is the strongest man I have ever known. Not because of a classified record that was illegally exposed by a member of my own board, a crime federal investigators are now prosecuting fully, and which this company has cooperated with completely. He is the strongest man I have ever known because 3 years ago, he walked away from a promotion that would have made him one of the most powerful commanders in the United States Navy, so that he could come home every single night to a little girl who had already lost one parent. He chose an ordinary life on purpose, deliberately, at enormous personal cost, because he believed his daughter deserved a father more than the world deserved another hero." A hand went up somewhere in the second row, a reporter unable to hold the question any longer, but Victoria continued before anyone could interrupt. "I will not stand here and use his sacrifice as a marketing tool for this company, the way it was nearly used as a weapon against me. I will not release further details about his service record, because that record was never mine to share, and it was violated once already in ways that put real people's lives in danger. What I will tell you is this: I am not resigning. I have made mistakes in how I handled the disclosure of my personal life, but I have not made mistakes in my stewardship of this company, and I will let the board's own review currently underway speak to that with full transparency. She took a breath, the room utterly silent, now waiting. And I will not distance myself from Ryan Mitchell to make any of this easier. Not for the board, not for the press cycle, not for anyone who believes a CEO's personal life should be smaller, safer, more convenient than the truth of who she actually is. I chose him before any of you knew his name. I am choosing him again publicly today, with full understanding of what that choice has already cost both of us and what it may yet cost us still. She stepped back from the podium, slightly signaling the end of her statement, though the room erupted immediately into a barrage of shouted questions, reporters competing to be heard over one another. Victoria answered exactly 3 of them, confirming the board's review timeline, confirming her full cooperation with the federal investigation into Damian Cross, and declining firmly, but without hostility, to answer any question that touched on operational details of Ryan's service. She left the podium to a wall of noise and flashing lights, and found Marcus waiting for her just outside the press room doors, his expression somewhere between shock and something that looked almost like pride. "That was not what the board approved," he said. "No. It might be the most honest thing I've ever watched a CEO say in a room full of cameras. Was it enough? Marcus considered this question seriously, the way he considered everything. "I don't know yet, but it was true. Sometimes that has to be enough on its own, regardless of what it costs." The board's formal review took 11 days. 11 days, during which Victoria continued running the company with the same rigor and precision she'd applied for 15 years, refusing to let the uncertainty around her own position slow a single quarterly decision, a single contract negotiation, a single meeting with the engineering teams, whose work had nothing at all to do with the scandal consuming her personal life. Ryan, in the meantime, faced his own reckoning. The Navy, forced to publicly address the leak of one of its most sensitive operations, launched an internal investigation of its own, one that ultimately cleared Ryan of any wrongdoing, but exposed him for the first time to a level of public scrutiny he had spent 3 years carefully avoiding. Old commanding officers gave interviews describing missions in vague, reverent terms. Former teammates spoke off the record about a man whose tactical instincts had saved more lives in a single operation than most officers saved across an entire career. The image the public eventually assembled of Ryan Mitchell bore little resemblance to the controversial figure Damian Cross had tried to manufacture. Instead, it looked increasingly like exactly what Victoria had described at that podium: a quiet hero who had chosen fatherhood over glory, and who had never once asked for any of the attention now surrounding him. Lily returned to school the week after Victoria's press conference, and though a handful of classmates asked questions about the news coverage, most of the attention faded faster than Ryan had feared. Children, it turned out, cared considerably less about classified operations than they cared about who had the best snacks at lunch, and within 2 weeks, Lily's biggest complaint had shifted from cameras outside her house to a disagreement with her best friend over whose turn it was to be line leader. "She's remarkably resilient," Victoria said one evening, sitting on Ryan's porch steps, watching Lily chase fireflies across the darkening yard with a mason jar clutched in one hand. "Kids usually are if the adults around them hold it together long enough to let them be." Ryan watched his daughter with an expression of quiet relief that Victoria had rarely seen on his face, a tension finally beginning to loosen after weeks of holding himself rigid against every possible threat. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. Some new leak, some new headline. It's strange having a few quiet weeks in a row. Strange good or strange bad? Strange good. I'd forgotten what that felt like." He glanced over at her. "The board review finishes tomorrow." "Tomorrow morning. Full vote of confidence or a formal request for my resignation. Whitfield wouldn't tell me which way it's leaning, which either means it's genuinely close or he's just better at keeping secrets than I gave him credit for." "Are you scared?" Victoria considered the question honestly, watching Lily's small figure dart between fireflies in the yard. 4 months ago, I would have said the idea of losing this company terrified me more than almost anything in the world. My grandfather built it. My father ran it into the ground emotionally, even while running it successfully financially, and I spent 30 years trying to prove I could do both, run it well, and not lose myself in the process. She paused. I'm still scared of losing it, but it's not the only thing I'm scared of losing anymore. That's new. I'm not sure it's a bad thing, even though it terrifies me. Ryan reached over and took her hand. The gesture easy now, familiar in a way it hadn't been even a month earlier. Two people who had been tested by something neither of them had chosen, and had come out the other side of it still choosing each other. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said, you didn't lose yourself in any of this. If anything, I watched you find something in that press room I don't think you knew you had. What's that? The willingness to lose something big publicly rather than keep pretending to be smaller than you actually are. He squeezed her hand gently. That's not nothing, Victoria. Most people never find that. Some people spend their whole lives hiding from the version of themselves willing to risk everything for something true. Yet, the board vote when it finally came was not unanimous, but it was decisive. 7 in favor of retaining Victoria's leadership. 2 opposed, 2 abstaining a margin, comfortable enough to end any immediate threat to her position, but close enough to remind her that trust, once shaken, took considerably longer to fully rebuild than a single honest press conference could accomplish. Whitfield delivered the news personally, finding her in her office afterward with an expression that carried both relief and a kind of weary respect. The board recognizes the company's performance under your leadership has remained exceptional throughout this entire ordeal, he said. But I'll tell you honestly, Victoria, several members expressed real concern about judgment, not about Mr. Mitchell, about the initial silence at the gala, about allowing a personal situation to develop into a corporate liability before addressing it directly. That's fair criticism, Victoria said. I've thought about little else for weeks. The board is also formally recommending an independent review of executive security protocols, given how easily Mr. Cross was able to weaponize a personal relationship against you. Going forward, any relationship deemed to carry potential security implications will require earlier, more proactive disclosure to the board's risk committee. Not for approval, he added quickly, seeing her expression shift, but for appropriate protective measures. We should have been protecting Mr. Mitchell's information from exactly this kind of exploitation from the beginning, rather than treating his existence as a liability to be managed after the fact. Victoria felt something ease in her chest at that, an acknowledgement she hadn't expected from a board she'd assumed throughout the entire crisis, viewed Ryan purely as a risk factor to be minimized, rather than a person deserving of protection in his own right. Thank you, Harold. Don't thank me yet. Damien's trial is going to keep this story in the news for months. You should prepare for that reality rather than assuming today's vote closes the book on any of it. I know. Victoria looked out at the harbor through her office window, the same water that had nearly killed her the night this entire story began. But I'm not managing this like a crisis anymore. I'm just living through it the same way anyone lives through something hard, one honest day at a time. Damien's trial began 3 months later, a slow, methodical unwinding of exactly how far his ambition had carried him. The initial legitimate research into Ryan's public record. The escalation into hiring a corporate investigator with connections to classified information brokers. And finally, the decision to authorize a leak so severe it had endangered an active intelligence network on another continent. The prosecution painted a portrait of a man who had convinced himself, step by step, that ambition justified almost any cost until the costs had grown too large to control or contain. Victoria testified for 2 full days, describing the board meeting where Damien had first presented his findings. The phone call warning her of the deeper leak, the 5 days of silence from Ryan, while he tried to determine how to protect his daughter from a danger he had spent 3 years specifically trying to prevent. She testified without embellishment, without theatrical outrage, simply describing what had happened with the same directness she'd used at the press conference months earlier. Ryan did not testify publicly his continued involvement with classified operations, made a courtroom appearance legally complicated in ways that took federal attorneys weeks to navigate. But he provided a sealed deposition that, according to the prosecutor who met with Victoria afterward, had been instrumental in establishing the full scope of danger the leak had created for people whose names would never appear in any public record at all. Damien was convicted on multiple counts related to unauthorized disclosure of classified information and conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. A sentence that effectively ended not just his career, but the entire narrative he had spent 8 years quietly constructing about his own inevitable rise to the top of Reynolds' defense. Victoria did not attend the sentencing. She had testified when the truth required it, cooperated fully when justice required it. But she felt no need to watch a man who had endangered a child and an entire intelligence network face the consequences of his own choices. That closure, she decided, belonged to the courtroom, not to her. The evening the verdict was announced, Ryan found her on the same dock where the entire story had begun, standing near the railing where a rogue wave had once nearly taken her life, watching the same harbor water that had connected them from the very first night. "You okay?" he asked, coming to stand beside her close enough that their shoulders brushed. "I keep thinking about how differently this could have gone," Victoria said quietly. "If you hadn't been standing exactly there that night, if that wave had hit 2 seconds earlier or later, if I'd corrected the photograph immediately instead of letting the silence stand. So many small moments, any one of which could have gone a completely different direction. But they didn't. No, they didn't." She turned to look at him, the harbor lights catching in his eyes the same way they had at the gala months earlier before any of this had started. "Lily asked me last week if I was going to be around forever. I didn't know how to answer her honestly because forever is a big word, and I've learned this year that even the most careful plans can come apart in ways nobody predicts." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I couldn't promise forever because nobody can honestly promise that to anyone. But I told her I could promise that as long as I was around, I wasn't going anywhere by choice. That whatever happened, it wouldn't be because I stopped choosing her or you." Victoria's voice softened. She said that was a good enough answer. Better than most grown-ups give her, apparently. Ryan reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The same small, tender gesture that had been photographed at the gala all those months earlier and had set off everything that followed. Except this time, there was no hidden photographer, no viral speculation, no misunderstanding to correct or deny. Just two people standing on a dock, choosing each other in plain sight with nothing left to hide. "I've been thinking about something," Ryan said. "The Navy offered me a new position, training role stateside, no deployment, no classified field operations. It would mean staying close to home permanently, close to Lily's school, close to you if you want that." "Do you want that?" "I want to stop living like every good thing in my life is one crisis away from disappearing." His voice was quiet, honest, in the specific way he'd been honest with her from their very first conversation in that stairwell. "I spent 3 years building walls around Lily and me, telling myself walls were the only way to keep her safe. This year taught me something different. The walls didn't protect us from Damien, or from the leak, or from any of the actual danger. What protected us was people you standing in that press room and telling the truth when it would have been easier to distance yourself. Marcus working around the clock to manage a crisis he didn't create. Even Whitfield pushing the board toward transparency instead of expedience. Walls don't build a life, Victoria. People do." Victoria felt something in her chest release a tension she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying since the night this entire story began. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to take the position. I'm saying I want to build something ordinary and stable for Lily, close to home, close to you. And I'm saying I'd like you to be part of that, not as a secret, not as a scandal to manage, but as exactly what you already are." He looked at her steadily. "Someone I choose. Every day on purpose, the same way I chose to walk away from that promotion 3 years ago. Deliberately. Without regret." Victoria smiled, the harbor wind catching her hair the same way it had the night they met. Except this time there was no wave threatening to knock her off balance. Nothing to catch her from nothing, to save her from except perhaps her own old instinct to keep the most important things in her life carefully, safely hidden. "I choose that too," she said. Behind them, further down the dock, Lily sat on a bench with a book in her lap, glancing up occasionally to watch her father and the woman who had somewhere in the middle of the hardest year of both their lives quietly become something neither of them had a simple word for. Yet not quite family in the way the paperwork would define it, but something real enough that Lily had stopped asking whether Victoria was leaving and started asking instead what time she was coming over for dinner. The harbor stretched dark and calm in front of them. Nothing like the storm that had first brought them together, and for the first time since that night, none of them felt the need to brace against whatever might come next. The transfer papers for Ryan's new position came through 6 weeks later, and the day he signed them, he drove straight from the base to Victoria's office, instead of walking past her assistant, with a grin that made the entire 14th floor pause, mid-sentence, something Victoria's staff had never once seen from the careful, guarded man who used to wait quietly in the lobby whenever he came to pick her up for dinner. "It's official," he said, dropping into the chair across from her desk, still in uniform, still catching his breath from taking the stairs instead of waiting for the elevator. "Stateside Training Command, no deployments. I start in 3 weeks." Victoria came around the desk and kissed him before he could say anything else. A kiss that had nothing hurried or hidden about it. Nothing that needed correcting or explaining to anyone who might have been watching through the glass walls of her office. When she pulled back, he was smiling in a way that had become more familiar over the past months, but still every time caught her slightly off guard with how much it changed his entire face. "Lily's going to be thrilled," Victoria said. "No more counting down deployment calendars." "She already knows. I picked her up from school on the way here and told her first." Ryan laughed, shaking his head. "You know what she said? She said, 'Does this mean you can finally come to my dance recital instead of watching it on video from a ship?' I told her yes. She looked at me like I'd just told her Christmas was moving to every day of the year." "She's not wrong to be excited. I'm excited too. I didn't expect to be, honestly. Some part of me thought walking away from field operations completely would feel like losing something. Instead, it just feels like I'm finally getting something back." He reached across the desk and took her hand. "A lot of that has to do with you, whether you want credit for it or not." Victoria smiled, though something in her expression carried a trace of complication that Ryan, attentive as always, caught immediately. "What is it?" "Nothing bad," she said quickly. "Just the board asked me something yesterday I haven't fully processed yet." "What?" "Succession planning. Whitfield wants me to start grooming an eventual successor, someone who could take over daily operations within the next 5 to 7 years, freeing me up for a more strategic advisory role." Victoria looked down at their joined hands. A year ago, that suggestion would have felt like a demotion, like being pushed toward the door before I was ready to leave. This time it felt like an invitation. An invitation to what? To actually have a life alongside the company instead of a life entirely consumed by it. My father never made that choice. He ran this place until the day he died, and by the time he died, there wasn't much of him left outside the boardroom for anyone to actually know. She met Ryan's eyes. "I don't want that to be the whole of my story. I want more of what I've had this past year, even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts, honestly, because they taught me more about who I actually am than any quarterly earnings report ever did." Oh. Lily's dance recital 6 weeks later became a small but meaningful marker of exactly how much had shifted since the chaotic months of scandal and investigation. Ryan sat in the third row of the community auditorium in civilian clothes, an ordinary father among dozens of other ordinary parents. Camera phone raised the same way everyone else's was raised, waiting for his daughter's group to take the stage. Victoria sat beside him, having rearranged an entire afternoon of board preparation to be there. Something her assistant had noted with visible surprise when she'd blocked the calendar 3 weeks in advance and refused to move it even when a major contract negotiation had threatened to run late. "She's going to look for us the second she walks out," Ryan said, his eyes already scanning the wings of the small stage. She always does. Even during rehearsal videos, she'd ask her teacher if she could see the camera to make sure I was watching. I remember when you couldn't even talk about missing recitals without your jaw tightening, Victoria said quietly. You'd get this look like you were furious at yourself for something that wasn't your fault. I was furious at myself. Every deployment, every mission that pulled me away from something that mattered to her felt like proof I was failing at the one job that actually counted. Ryan's expression softened watching the stage. I don't feel that anymore. I think that's the biggest thing that's changed. Not the job, not even the two of us. Just, I stopped believing that loving my country and loving my daughter had to be a zero-sum trade. Turns out there was a version where I could do both if I was willing to give up the parts of my career that demanded I choose. The lights dimmed and a row of small girls in pale blue costumes filed onto the stage. Lily easily identifiable among them by the intensity of her concentration, her tongue poking slightly out of the corner of her mouth, the way it always did when she was focused on getting something exactly right. When the music started and the girls began their careful, uneven choreography, Ryan leaned forward slightly, phone raised, but his eyes never actually needed the screen. He watched his daughter directly unfiltered present in a way that 3 years earlier would have required him to be watching from a grainy satellite feed thousands of miles away. Grateful just for a few pixelated seconds of her face. Halfway through the routine, exactly as Ryan had predicted, Lily's eyes found the third row, found her father's face, and her small, serious concentration broke into a wide, unguarded grin that nearly threw off her next step. Ryan grinned back, and beside him, Victoria felt something in her chest ache with a tenderness she hadn't expected to feel this deeply for a child who wasn't biologically hers. A feeling that had crept up on her slowly over the past year until it had become without her fully noticing the transition. Something indistinguishable from love. After the recital, backstage, Lily ran directly into her father's arms, still in her costume. Tutu, slightly crushed from the enthusiasm of the hug, and then turned immediately to Victoria with the same energy. Did you see me? Did you see the spin part? I almost fell, but I didn't. I saw every second, Victoria said, crouching down to Lily's eye level. You were the best one up there. I'm not just saying that because I like you. You have to say that because you like me. That's the rule. Lily said it with total seriousness, the kind of logic only a 7-year-old could deliver with complete confidence. Fine. Then I'm saying it because it's true and also because I like you. Both things can be true at once. Lily considered this compromise acceptable and threw her arms around Victoria's neck in a hug that Victoria hadn't expected, and that landed somewhere deep and unguarded in her chest, a place she'd spent 30 years keeping carefully protected from exactly this kind of unearned, uncomplicated love. The following spring brought a quiet Sunday afternoon that none of them would have called significant in advance, but that would in hindsight mark the moment the entire shape of their family finally settled into something permanent. Ryan had spent the morning teaching Lily to ride a bike without training wheels in the driveway of the house he'd bought the year before, larger than his old place, close enough to Victoria's apartment that the back and forth between the two homes had started to feel less like visiting and more like simply living across two addresses that both counted as home. Victoria arrived in the early afternoon with grocery bags for dinner and found Ryan sitting on the front steps nursing a scraped elbow, while Lily, triumphant and unbothered by her own tumble, continued circling the driveway on 2 wheels with the fierce concentration of a child who had just discovered she could do something the world had told her was hard. She fell 4 times before she got it, Ryan said, wincing slightly as he flexed his elbow. I fell trying to catch her the 4th time. Pretty sure I'm getting too old for this. You're 38, Ryan. You survived active combat deployments. I think you can survive a 7-year-old's bicycle lesson. Combat didn't have this level of unpredictability. He laughed, watching his daughter make another wobbly but increasingly confident loop around the driveway. I used to think the scariest thing in the world was a mission going sideways with no exfil plan. Turns out it's watching your kid learn to ride a bike and knowing you can't actually protect her from every possible scrape along the way. You just have to let her fall enough times to learn how to get back up. Victoria sat down beside him on the step, setting the grocery bags down carefully. That sounds like it might be a metaphor you're building toward. Maybe. Ryan glanced at her sideways, something in his expression shifting into a seriousness she recognized as significant even before he spoke again. I've been thinking about something for a while now, about us, about what comes next if anything does. Victoria felt her pulse quicken slightly, though she kept her expression steady, the same careful composure that had served her through boardrooms and press conferences, now serving her through a much more personal kind of negotiation. What have you been thinking? That I don't want to keep living in two houses that happen to be close together. That Lily asks at least twice a week why you don't just live with us instead of driving back and forth every night. That I've spent the past year and a half watching you choose this family, choose me, choose her, over and over again, in situations that would have given most people every reasonable excuse to walk away. He reached into his jacket pocket, and Victoria's breath caught before he even finished the motion, understanding exactly what was coming before she saw the small box in his hand. I'm not a man who does things halfway, Victoria. I never have been. I walked away from a promotion because half measures weren't good enough for my daughter. I'm not interested in half measures with you either. He opened the box, a simple ring inside it. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that matched the scale of wealth Victoria commanded in every other part of her life, but exactly the kind of thoughtful, deliberate choice she'd come to recognize as entirely unmistakably him. Victoria Reynolds, he said. I'm not asking because a photograph once made the world think we were already married. I'm asking because I've spent every day since that photograph proving to myself, and hopefully to you, that the world wasn't wrong about what it saw. It was just early. Will you marry me? Victoria felt tears she hadn't expected gathering unbidden and unstoppable, and she looked past Ryan for a moment, to where Lily had stopped her bicycle at the end of the driveway, watching the two of them with an expression of barely contained excitement, clearly having known exactly what was about to happen. Yes, Victoria said, and the word came out steadier than she expected, certain in a way that surprised even her. Yes, absolutely yes. Lily let out a whoop that echoed down the quiet street, abandoning her bicycle in the middle of the driveway to run toward them, and the three of them ended up in a tangled, laughing embrace on the front steps. Victoria's grocery bags forgotten beside them, the late afternoon sun catching the small ring now on her finger in a way that felt finally entirely uncomplicated. The wedding, when it came 8 months later, was nothing like the lavish, media-managed events Victoria had attended throughout her career as CEO. No press credentials, no red carpet, no carefully curated guest list designed to maximize favorable coverage. It took place in the backyard of the house Ryan had bought under a simple white arch Ryan and two of his old teammates had built themselves over a weekend, with fewer than 60 guests seated in folding chairs across the lawn. Marcus stood as Victoria's best man, an arrangement that had made both of them laugh when she first suggested it, given the traditional roles usually assigned to such positions. 15 years of fixing your crises, he'd said when she asked him. Feels wrong not to be standing up there for the one good thing that came out of the biggest crisis of all. Lily, 7 years old and entirely convinced of her own critical importance to the proceedings, served as flower girl, scattering rose petals down the aisle with the same fierce concentration she'd once brought to her dance recital, occasionally pausing to make sure everyone was watching her do it correctly. When Victoria walked down the aisle, she wore something simple, deliberately understated, a choice that had drawn mild protest from a wedding planner accustomed to clients who wanted spectacle. Victoria had wanted more than anything for this particular day to belong entirely to her and Ryan and Lily, not to a version of herself constructed for public consumption. Ryan stood at the end of the aisle in a simple gray suit, and the expression on his face as he watched her approach carried none of the guarded, careful control she'd first encountered in that stairwell nearly 2 years earlier. He looked in that moment like a man who had spent years believing he'd already used up his allotment of happiness and had been astonished to discover more of it waiting for him anyway. "You look like you're about to cry," Victoria whispered as she reached him, taking his hands. "Seals don't cry," he whispered back, though his eyes were suspiciously bright. Sure they don't. The officiant, an old friend of Ryan's from his early Navy days, who had gotten ordained specifically for the occasion, kept the ceremony brief and unpretentious, exactly as they'd requested. When it came time for vows, Ryan spoke first, his voice steady, despite the emotion clearly moving beneath it. I spent 3 years after Sarah died, believing that the only way to protect what mattered most was to keep the world at a careful distance, he said. You taught me that real protection doesn't come from distance. It comes from choosing people fully, even when choosing them is dangerous, even when the world tries to make that choice cost everything. You chose Lily and me when it would have been easier professionally and personally not to. I promise to spend the rest of my life choosing you back the same way every single day without half measures. Victoria. When it was her turn, found the prepared words she'd written the week before suddenly inadequate against what she actually wanted to say. I built my entire life around the belief that strength meant never needing anyone, she said, her voice catching slightly. You and Lily taught me that real strength is being brave enough to need people anyway, and to let them see exactly how much you need them, even when it terrifies you. I promise to keep choosing this family out loud without apology for as long as I live. They exchanged rings, and when the officiant pronounced them married, Lily let out another whoop from her position beside the arch exactly as she had the day of the proposal. And the small crowd of 60 guests erupted into laughter and applause that felt in its modest, unguarded warmth more meaningful than any of the 1,000-guest galas Victoria had hosted throughout her career. Itchy. A year into the marriage, a reporter from a regional magazine writing a feature on military families and corporate leadership, an entirely different tone than the frantic adversarial coverage of the scandal years earlier, approached the family at a Navy charity event honoring military spouses and children, an event Victoria had specifically chosen to support, once she understood through Ryan exactly how much invisible sacrifice military families carried without recognition. The reporter, a woman roughly Victoria's age, with a warm, genuinely curious demeanor rather than the sharp hunger for scandal, Victoria had grown used to fielding, smiled and asked a simple, ordinary question. So what does your husband do for a living? A year earlier, at another event much like this one, Victoria had let a similar question hang in uncorrected silence, and that silence had nearly cost her everything she'd eventually come to treasure most. This time, she didn't hesitate. She reached over and took Ryan's hand, feeling the familiar steady warmth of his fingers close around hers, and smiled at the reporter with an openness that carried none of the careful calculation she'd once brought to every public interaction. He protects people, Victoria said. For years he did it as a Navy SEAL in places most of us will never fully understand, at costs most of us will never fully appreciate. Now he does it training the next generation of officers to carry that same responsibility with the same care he always brought to it himself. And every single day, he does it as a father raising the most remarkable daughter I've ever known. And as a husband who taught me that real strength means letting people see exactly how much you need them. Ryan looked at her, and something passed between them that needed no further words. The same quiet recognition that had first passed between them in a stairwell on a stormy night nearly 3 years earlier. Except now, it carried none of the uncertainty, none of the caution, none of the walls either of them had once believed were necessary for survival. "And what about you?" the reporter asked, turning to Ryan. "How does it feel being married to one of the most powerful CEOs in the country?" Ryan considered the question for a moment, his eyes drifting to where Lily stood a few feet away, animatedly showing another military kid her newest dinosaur drawing. This one, finally with a tail, colored the correct shade of green. "Honestly," he said, "I don't think of her as powerful because of the company. I think of her as powerful because of what she was willing to risk to protect the people she loved when protecting us cost her almost everything she'd spent her whole career building. That's the kind of power that actually matters. The rest is just a title on a business card." The reporter smiled, jotting down a note, and moved on to another family nearby, leaving the three of them standing together near the edge of the harbor, the same body of water that had nearly taken Victoria's life, on the night this entire story began. Now simply the quiet, ordinary backdrop to an evening spent honoring families who understood better than most exactly what it cost to choose love in the face of danger. Lily ran back over, breathless, with the particular urgency of an 8-year-old with important news to share. "Dad, can we get ice cream on the way home? Mom said if it was okay with you, it was okay with her." Ryan glanced at Victoria, a small warm smile passing between them at the casual, unremarkable way their daughter had used the word mom, a word that had arrived gradually over the past year, unforced, unprompted, simply the natural evolution of a bond that had never needed a legal document to make it real. Though the adoption paperwork Victoria had quietly filed 6 months into the marriage had made it official all the same. "Ice cream sounds perfect," Ryan said, scooping Lily up despite her protests that she was too old to be carried, though she wrapped her arms around his neck anyway, unwilling to actually argue the point too hard. They walked together along the harbor path as the evening light softened over the water. 3 people who had been thrown together by a storm and nearly separated by everything that followed. Institutional betrayal, classified danger, a public scandal that had tested every instinct either adult had to protect themselves by retreating into isolation. They had chosen instead again and again at every point where retreat would have been easier to stay, to be seen, to risk everything visible and public rather than settle for something safe and hidden. The world had once mistaken a CEO and a Navy father for a couple at a chance encounter neither of them had planned. It had taken every hard month since that mistaken photograph for the mistake to become something truer than either of them could have predicted on that first stormy night. Not an accident of appearances, but a family built deliberately choice by choice through every circumstance that might have driven them apart. They were not a couple because a photograph said so. They were a family because they had chosen relentlessly and completely to become one. And that choice, made in the full light of every storm the world had thrown at them, would never need correcting again.